has Frankenstein impacted modern literature? Alrighty, writers. How has Frankenstein impacted modern literature? We all know the tale of Frankenstein. This man goes mad and creates this creature by piecing together different parts of bodies. He brings it to life and is so terrified out of his mind that he runs away from it, which causes this creature to be released into the world to do the horrific things that it does. This tale is so impactful. I want to talk about 4 main ways that it impacts the world of literature. The first way is that it still sells so many copies every year. It sells over 40,000 copies, even though it has been 200 years since it was released. To put that in perspective, it sells more copies than most other books, even the books that are published today. This makes it so that, well, it drives people to stores to buy the books, of course, and it also shows that it's just impactful in the reading world because obviously if these readers are buying the book, they're reading it, they're discussing it, and they're admiring it. I also want to mention that not only are so many copies sold, but of the first editions of the book, a couple of them have been sold for more than $1 million. The second way in which Frankenstein impacts the literary world is the fact that it may have been the first horror novel. Now, there are arguments that Frankenstein wasn't necessarily the first horror novel, depending on how you define horror. Because Frankenstein is the first book that I would say you can easily just say, this is horror. Like, there's no debating it. It's horror. This is a horror novel. But there are tales from beforehand that have that have scary aspects. Scary stories have been around since the beginning of time. For example, Beowulf stems from long before Frankenstein. It began with oral tradition, back when we didn't even write down our stories, we just passed them down through word of mouth. But Beowulf is generally considered an epic poem, and while there are horrific elements of the story, I wouldn't necessarily call it a horror story. Then there is The Castle of Otranto, which is a very good contender for the title of the first horror novel. And that is because it was the first Gothic novel. So this leads to the question of how you define horror, because, well, there is a difference between the Gothic genre and the horror genre. And Gothic horror does exist. So you could argue that The Castle of Otranto is Gothic horror, but to me, I see it as more of a Gothic comedy or a Gothic tragedy rather than a Gothic horror, because the author was keeping in mind Shakespeare's plays while writing it. And I would love to talk more about The Castle of Otranto, but because I have a copy that I annotated, but I don't have that here with me, sadly. Other books that have been said to possibly be the first horror novel is Dracula, The Picture of Dorian Gray, these other iconic figures of horror, which definitely did have an impact on the genre, but they came after, which gives the title back to Frankenstein. And through all this discussion, whether Frankenstein is the very first horror novel or not does not change the fact that it truly established or maybe cemented the genre into being. It is such a huge genre today. I was just in Barnes & Noble the other day and the horror section was huge. It was multiple aisles long. The third way in which Frankenstein deeply impacted the world of literature is the possibility that it also created the science fiction genre. The idea of mixing elements of science with fiction, that idea, it existed long before this book, but it could possibly be considered the first novel of science fiction. I have heard that Metamorphosis might be the first science fiction book, but it was published after Frankenstein, so that takes it out of the running just with that. But I do want to talk about that a little bit because I do love the story of Metamorphosis, and honestly, I don't consider it to be a science fiction novel because while you could see the book as of this man who literally turns into a bug and has to deal with that, you can also interpret it as this man who suddenly becomes bedridden, either because of a physical disability or a mental ailment, and so I don't consider this novel to be science fiction. So I've spoken now about two genres, both horror and science fiction, which Frankenstein may have began or at least cemented into being. It has had such a large impact on literature as a whole, especially because both science fiction and horror today are such popular genres. Now for the fourth and final way in which Frankenstein has changed the landscape of literature forever. Many novelists have taken inspiration from Frankenstein for their own novels. The concept of either reanimated something that was once alive, or the concept of creating life from something that never had life. Those concepts have been used again and again in literature, and that began with Frankenstein. It has happened so many times that it has become its own trope. Without it, we wouldn't even have the Jurassic Park or Jurassic World books and movies. But also, so much of contemporary literature was inspired by Frankenstein. And there have been countless books of just retellings, not even books inspired by Frankenstein, but just retellings of Frankenstein. But there are so many popular contemporary books that have been published within the last couple years that only exist because of Mary Shelley's work. The Children on the Hill is a book that I'm not going to talk too much about because you have to read it. It is so twisty. It's about these kids with their grandma, and this kid, she has joined them and they don't know where she's from. She's kind of weird, but that's all I'm going to tell you. I do recommend that one a lot. I enjoyed it. There's also The Bone Garden, which is a children's book. I recently read that. It's about this evil woman who lives on a cemetery and has brought children to life so that they can find bones in tunnels under the graves. And like the bone dust is magical. It's an interesting story. I do recommend it to kids. It was a fun one. And adults. I enjoyed it. And there's The Daughter of Dr. Moreau, which is by the same author as Mexican Gothic, one of my favorite books ever. The Daughter of Dr. Moreau was such an interesting concept because it was about this girl turning into a woman named Carlotta, who she lives on this hacienda where her father creates these creatures that are part human and part animal. The last book I want to talk about, even though there are so many more books based on Frankenstein because it's such an interesting topic, but the last book I want to talk about is the book I'm currently reading right now, and that is Cleopatra and Frankenstein. This book is actually, of all of these books I mentioned, the most loosely based on Frankenstein because not much of it is connected to the book. From what I gathered from the beginning is Cleopatra and Frankenstein are the two main characters. Cleopatra, her name is Cleo, actually, and Frankenstein, he's Frank. I do think there's more to this allegory, however. I have no idea because I'm not all the way through. But I believe it might be trying to say something about the monsters inside of us, or the monster that a man can become. To wrap this all up, Frankenstein has impacted literature through so many ways. It impacts literature through its constant sales, its creation or impact on the horror and science fiction genres. And lastly, it impacts modern literature through how many books only exist because Mary Shelley chose to write Frankenstein. If you got this far, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it, and see you next time. I'm gonna go read this book now.